Chapter 16, the urinary system. Here are the primary objectives for this chapter, and as you can see there's not too many of these, but anyway, I'll stop for a second so you can pause the video. Okay. Section 16.1, the kidneys are the core of the urinary system. And here's a list of the functions of the urinary system. It excretes fluid waste, which include urine and nitrogenous waste, and this helps to maintain fluid balance and blood volume. And this is typically the function we think of when we think of the urinary system. It also helps to regulate blood composition, and most of these other functions are actually related to this. The urinary system helps to maintain blood pressure. It also monitors and maintains erythrocyte levels. It assists in vitamin D synthesis. The urinary system regulates the ionic composition of the blood. It regulates the pH of the blood. It helps to maintain the blood glucose levels. And finally, certain parts of the urinary system produce hormones which regulate calcium levels. The urinary system consists of only 4 types of organs, and these are the 2 kidneys, the 2 ureters connected to each kidney, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. And these are all shown at right. Now we're going to go into more detail about each of the organs of the urinary system. We'll start with the kidneys, which are the filtering organs of the system. And we have 2 kidneys, both of which are fist-sized and bean-shaped, and they lie immediately beneath the back of the musculature. And due to this placement, which is basically on either side of your lower back or spine, they are susceptible to damage from external blows. However, they are embedded in a protective layer of fat to provide some cushioning. They are both covered with a tough outer membrane called the renal capsule. And due to the placement of the liver, which displaces the right kidney and makes it slightly lower than the left kidney. Here's more about the structure of the kidneys. Each kidney has a large renal artery which enters the kidney at the hilus, and this hilus also serves as the exit site for the renal vein, and also the kidney's nerves, some lymphatic vessels, and the ureter. Now within the kidney there is a uniform outer cortex and an irregular inner medulla. And this cortex within the kidney appears to be grainy and solid, and portions of it dip between the renal pyramids of the medulla. And these renal pyramids are cone-shaped structures formed from an accumulation of the collecting ducts which drain the urine from the renal cortex to the renal pelvis. And the renal pelvis is the area adjacent to the hilus, and this is where the urine is collected and passed to the ureters. And this structure is coated in a protective mucous membrane which is lined with many layers of cells to prevent significant osmosis or diffusion from the urine into the cells. And this is because we've already filtered the urine and we don't really want to refilter it because stuff's diffused back in. Here's a diagram which really simplifies what I just said. So we have the renal capsule, which is this membrane that encloses and encircles the kidney. Then we have the renal cortex, which is right beneath this capsule, and it's supposed to be grainy and solid, like I said. And then we have the renal pyramids, which are pretty easy to see because they're these darker kind of pyramid or triangular shaped structures. And then you can also see where the renal artery feeds into the kidney and where the renal vein exits it. You can also see the renal pelvis, which is essentially where the ureters sit in there. And then you see the ureter, which goes down to the bladder. Blood flow through the kidneys is highly structured and regulated. A quarter of the blood flow from each and every heartbeat is actually sent to the kidneys. The blood flowing through the kidneys takes a long and circuitous route. So first the blood enters the kidneys via the renal artery. This renal artery then branches into the segmental arteries, and each of these is responsible for supplying the renal pyramids of the kidneys with blood. The segmental arteries then give rise to the interlobular arteries, which deliver the blood to the renal pyramids. The interlobular arteries then take the blood to the renal cortex, where they divide further into the afferent arterioles, the efferent arterioles, and the capillaries. The afferent arteries arrive at the glomerulus, while the efferent arterioles exit this structure. The filtered blood winds its way through the kidney via the efferent arterioles, where it moves to the capillaries and is then collected by the interlobular veins. So now we're kind of moving out of the kidneys such that we're at structures called veins. The pathway then reverses, like I said, moving through the interlobular and segmental veins, and then this filtered blood leaves the kidney through the renal vein. And it should be completely, or as filtered as it's going to be by the kidney at this point. So if you thought the previous slide was too wordy and kind of complicated, here I've simplified the path blood takes through the kidneys. So first, blood enters the kidneys via the renal artery. Then it enters the segmental arteries, which lead into the interlobular arteries of the renal pyramid. These lead to the afferent arterioles, which lead to capillaries, which lead further to afferent arterioles, which then become interlobular veins, and then finally renal veins, and this is where the blood is exiting the kidney and returning back to the cardiovascular system, even though I guess technically it never really left it. In addition to filtering the blood, the kidneys also produce hormones, and your book doesn't really go into much detail about this, but here they are. There's calcitrol, which is the active form of vitamin D, and this hormone is responsible for helping to maintain blood calcium levels. There's also erythropoietin, or EPO, which we talked about in the cardiovascular chapter, and if you'll recall, this stimulates the production of new erythrocytes, or red blood cells. And then there's renin, which is involved in fluid balance. So now that we've traced the path which blood takes through the kidneys, we're going to talk about the actual filtration which the kidneys are responsible for. And to do this, we need to first talk about the nephrons, which are the filtering units of the kidneys. And each kidney can be composed of or contain 1 million or more nephrons, and these nephrons are packed together under the renal capsule. And they serve as sites where the wastes are removed from the blood and the ions and nutrients are returned to the cardiovascular system. And I should say that the ions are also sometimes, and quite often, removed from the blood. And these nephrons are actually scattered throughout the renal cortex. The nephrons located near the surface of the renal cortex are referred to as the cortical nephrons, and those deeper within the cortex are called juxtamedullary nephrons. And now we're going to talk about this structure called the glomerulus, and this is the vessel knot at the beginning of each nephron, and this is formed from the incoming arteriole. The glomerular capsule, also called the Bowman's capsule, but we're not going to call it the Bowman's capsule because this is an improper name. But anyway, the glomerular capsule surrounds the glomerulus. The blood vessel leading into each nephron also then breaks into peritubular capillaries, which are really the capillaries surrounding the nephron, and these wind around the entire nephron before collecting into the ventricles, which eventually become the renal vein. Once the waste products are filtered, they then leave the glomerulus and enter the tubule. And this tubule actually consists of three parts. There's the proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT, which extends from the glomerular capsule. There's the nephron loop, also called the loop of Henle, but just like the term Bowman's capsule, we're not going to use the term loop of Henle because it's not a proper term. And the nephron loop is the portion of the nephron which extends from the cortex into the medulla of the kidneys and then collects at the DCT, and DCT refers to the distal convoluted tubule, which connects to a collecting duct. And this collecting duct gathers the newly formed urine from a series of nephrons and then drains this urine into the renal pelvis. And the collecting ducts actually comprise the majority of the renal pyramids. And the body actually maintains more nephrons than it needs, which is kind of strange because usually our body just has an amount of organs or organ structures tailored to its needs rather than having extras. But in the kidneys, this excess number of nephrons is what guarantees that urine function will never be compromised by small infections or slight damage to the kidneys, which would reduce the filtration rate if it were not for these extra nephrons. And the fact that we have two kidneys is also strange because one kidney is enough to provide all of the body's blood filtering needs. Thus, we have a spare kidney, which of course is helpful if we are needing a kidney, so we can just take one from another person and they don't develop any problems and we solve our problem. I should also say that in the context of these proximal convoluted tubule and the distal convoluted tubula, the term convoluted means to be twisted or coiled, and both of these tubule structures are twisted or coiled. And we're going to look at the structure of nephrons in this next slide. In this diagram, we're looking at a nephron and its associated capillary bed, and we're actually just zooming in on this nephron, which is a cortical nephron because it's just below the surface of the renal capsule. And we can look at the flow of fluid through the nephron. First, it is filtered in the glomerulal capsule, and then this leads into the proximal convoluted tubule, the descending limb of the nephron loop, and then the ascending limb of the nephron loop, and then finally this all leads to the distal convoluted tubule, which drains into the collecting duct. But anyway, you can see on this diagram where the efferent arteriole feeds into the glomerulus, and then you can see where where the afferent arteriole comes out of the glomerulus. And then you can see all of these tubule structures. So the proximal convoluted tubule is that yellow tube leading down, and the descending, or the distal convoluted tubule is that tube leading up, and then the nephron loop is the actual loop there. And then finally, when we're at this distal convoluted tubule, it eventually feeds into this collecting duct, which is this thick yellow tube which leads down. And at this point, we should have fully formed urine within the collecting duct. Section 16.2, urine is made, transported, and stored. So now that we've talked about the various structures involved with urine formation, we're going to discuss the actual process. Urine formation begins in the glomerulus and is finalized in the renal pelvis, and is accomplished through the processes of filtration active transport, and osmosis. As blood passes through the glomerulus of the nephron, most of the fluid in the blood is forced out, and it then enters the lumen of the nephron. The first step of urine formation is called glomerular filtration, and in this process, water, nitrogenous wastes, nutrients, and salts are forced from the blood at this point, and they go into the lumen of the nephron, like I said. Don't worry, some of these substances are going to go right back in the blood, though. Here's more about glomerular filtration. So the blood pressure within the glomerulus is higher than that of the systolic blood pressure, which of course is a necessary feature. This pressure increase is partially caused by the kinking and twisting of the glomerular vessels. So anytime you kink or twist any tube full of water, you're going to see an increase in pressure. Also, the efferent atrials have a larger diameter than the efferent atrials, and this creates back pressure, which raises the total blood pressure. And the total pressure on the blood is what forces most of the fluid into the capsule. However, to filter the blood pressure must overcome the capsular pressure, as well as overcoming the osmotic pressure within the blood itself. If the systolic pressure of the blood outside of the glomerulus drops below 60 millimeters of mercury, the blood in the glomerulus will not be forced through the glomerular wall, and the glomerular pressure will not be high enough to force the plasma from the blood vessels. And this can cause health complications, obviously, because we're not really filtering our blood very well. And this would be a side effect of having a low blood pressure, though having a low blood pressure is pretty rare in this country. 3 criteria must be met in order to filter the blood plasma through the glomerulus. First, the blood pressure must be high enough to force the plasma out of the glomerular vessel walls. The fluid already in the glomerulus must have a low enough pressure to allow more fluid to be forced into the nephron tubes. And finally, the osmotic pressure of the blood in the pertubular capillaries must be high enough to drain water back into the capillaries from the nephron tubule. And this is because we simply don't want to lose any water, or any more water than we have to here. So probably the best way to sum up how filtration or glomerular filtration works is that it is nearly completely dependent on pressure. So during this filtration, the formed elements or blood cells and plasma proteins remain in the glomerular vessel because they are simply too large to pass into the glomerulus itself. And when they're talking about this vessel, they're just talking about the convoluted blood vessel within the actual glomerular capsule. And the proteins left in the capillary blood help to set up the osmotic gradient that later pulls most of the water from the filtrate back into the blood. And every day, approximately 180 liters of fluid are filtered from the blood, but only a small amount of this is actually excreted because we return a lot of the water back to the blood. So this diagram just explains further what was talked about in the previous slides. So at number 1, the pressure of the blood in the glomerular vessel causes fluid to leak into the nephron. At number 2, the fluid already in the nephron exerts an opposite force. The back pressure prevents a huge influx of filtrate into the nephron. The blood, now higher in solute concentration, or you can say it's thicker, pulls water back into it from the more watery filtrate in the nephron. The net filtration pressure is the sum of three forces. It's kind of difficult to say it's difficult to say what three forces is talking about here. So this leads to pushing the fluid into the nephron while pulling water back from the nephron. So essentially here we're just trying to get rid of filtrates like wastes and some ions we don't need, and pull the water that we need back into the blood stream. The second step of urine formation is tubular reabsorption, which recycles the water that we removed from the blood and brings it back into the blood. And this is step 2. Tubular reabsorption is the process in which the ions in water are returned to the pretubular capillaries. So not only are we returning water, we're also returning ions to the blood based on our ionic or electrolyte needs. Approximately 65% of the filtered water is returned to the blood immediately at the proximal convoluted tubule. The walls of the proximal convoluted tubule have a large surface area which accommodates all of this reabsorption. So once again, we're talking about surface area, which is a all-important topic in biological sciences. So the cells which line the PCT are covered with microvilli, and whenever you see or hear microvilli, it's probably a good idea to think of an increase of surface area, because that's really why we have them. And these cells which line the PCT are adjacent to the endothelial cells of the pretubular capillaries, which creates a thin layer that allows diffusion from the tubule to the blood. And of course you always need, or it's preferable to have a thin layer for diffusion. And in addition to returning the water to the blood, in tubular reabsorption we also return glucose, amino acids, and salts to the bloodstream. So the essential ions that we're returning to the blood are actually returned through the process of diffusion, whereas the water that we're sending back to the blood gets there through osmosis. And larger molecules like glucose return using facilitated diffusion. There are typically enough receptors to remove all the glucose from the filtrate and return it to the blood. However, if we have excess glucose in the blood, it will overrun these receptors and drop from the proximal convoluted tubule into the loop of the nephron. And glucose cannot be returned to the bloodstream once it drops into the loop of nephron beyond the PCT. So this leads to it spilling, or rather being placed into the urine. And this glucose spilling is a symptom of diabetes. So we simply just have so much glucose within the bloodstream that it filters back into the bloodstream. Or rather returns back to the bloodstream. Tubular secretion is the third and final step in urine formation. And in this step, products from the blood are removed. I think possibly an easier way to remember the 3 steps of urine formation is just to refer to them as filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. It just kind of simplifies things. But anyway, tubular secretion is a final fine-tuning step where we regulate the amounts of dissolved compounds in the blood and urine, just so we keep what we need in the blood and remove what we don't want in the urine. So waste products and other unwanted substances such as steroids or drug byproducts from either legal or illegal drugs, obviously. Anyway, these particles can be too large to filter from the blood at the glomerulus, so they are actively secreted into the filtrate at the distal convoluted tubule. Tubular secretion takes place within the loop of the nephron and the collecting duct, which remove even more water from the filtrate, and this allows for the precise regulation of fluid loss. The descending arm of the loop of the nephron is permeable to water, but the ascending limb is not. So water leaves the filtrate as it moves down the loop of the nephron, whereas salts leave the filtrate as it flows up the ascending arm, creating a salt gradient in the medulla of the kidney. And this process is key to regulating the concentration of water in blood and also the concentration of the salts in blood and urine. This picture just summarizes urine formation, and it also tells you what urine formation process is taking place in each part of the nephron. So at the glomerulus, filtration is carried out, and at the proximal convoluted tubule, it's mostly involved in reabsorption, but also secretion of these ions and other chemicals into the urine. And then in the nephron loop, we have mostly the process of reabsorption and the secretion of urea into the urine. At the distal convoluted tubule, it's also involved in reabsorption, and also, and very important to this part of the kidney, is that very important to the removal of urine from the blood is the fact that the distal convoluted tubule is the part of the nephron responsible for secreting steroids and drug breakdown products. And then at the collecting duct, it's just involved in secretion of either potassium ions or hydrogen ions. So, by way of the ureters, urine is transported to the urinary bladder for storage. So once the filtrate has passed through the nephron and the collecting ducts and reaches the renal pelvis, it is here at this point that it is finally referred to as urine. And I'm going to retract what I said in a previous slide just because of this sentence. In the collecting duct, we have essentially a substance that is very much like urine, but as it hasn't reached the renal pelvis, it cannot technically be referred to as urine. Water can still be removed as the urine sits in the remaining organs of the urinary system, however, and this is just another way for us to conserve water. And below in the chart, we have the substance that is either filtered, reabsorbed, and excreted in the urine, and the rate at which it's, or rather not the rate, but how much of it is filtered, reabsorbed, and excreted per day. And I don't think I'm going to really cover this too much on the test, except probably where it concerns water and sodium and also glucose as it relates to diabetes. Urea is also pretty important too. So just really look at those four if you're going to do anything with this chart. One problem related to the urinary system is that sometimes we form kidney stones, and these occur when water in the renal pelvis continues to leave the urine, which leads to further concentration of the salts in the urine, which can ultimately lead to the formation of these stones. Now, these are obviously rock-like masses, and they're usually composed of calcium oxalate. Eventually, kidney stones can grow large enough to block renal flow. Kidney stones are extremely painful as they typically have jagged or pointy edges. There are two forms of treatment to get rid of kidney stones. The first one is to drink lots of water to push the stone through the urinary system and just wait for the stone to pass out in the urine. Ultrasound waves can also be used, and these are fired at the stone, and they cause the kidney stone to break into smaller pieces, and then these small fragments are passed through the urine. And if you have a history of developing kidney stones, and it's actually a fairly common occurrence for people to have kidney stones, but anyway, if you have a history of forming these stones, it's best to avoid foods high in calcium. to eat less protein, and to eat less protein could probably be applied to anyone. And this is because protein lowers pH within the body, and stones form easier in this environment. And it's also advisable to drink more fluid than you typically drink. Urine leaves the kidneys through the ureters, and these ureters are long, thin, muscular tubes lined with mucosa. They loop behind the urinary bladder and enter the bladder at its base, such that the ureters are not dislodged or misplaced or otherwise moved as the bladder fills. So since the nephrons constantly form urine, these ureters are always full of fluid. And as more urine is produced, more urine is pushed down the ureters and into the bladder due to bulk flow. In these pictures you can clearly see where the bladder is, and you can also see where the ureters go back behind the bladder. And obviously you can't really see where they enter at the base too terribly well. In the one at the left, it looks like you can actually see the urine within the bladder. Or maybe that's just a scrunched up bladder, I'm not sure. And you can also see the bladder's position and the ureter's position in relation to the kidneys. The urinary bladder stores urine before its excretion from the body. The urinary bladder is a hollow, variable-sized organ, and it lies within the pelvic cavity posterior to the pubic bones and the pubic symphysis. Now the trigon, which honestly sounds like the name of a Pokemon, but it's actually the triangular area at the base of the bladder where the two ureters enter and the urethra exits the bladder. The bladder is lined with transitional epithelium, which allow for it to expand without tearing or destroying the integrity of the inner lining of the bladder. An empty bladder is actually the size of a walnut, so I guess the reason they're saying it's variable sized is that the size of the bladder depends on how much urine is being stored in there. The process of releasing urine from the body is urination, which can also be called voiding or micturition if you want to get technical. When the bladder contains approximately 300 milliliters, the pressure within the bladder stimulates the stretch receptors to send a nerve impulse to the micturition center in the central nervous system. The created micturition reflex causes the contraction of the walls of the bladder and the relaxation of the internal urethral sphincter muscle, which if you'll recall is, well, a sphincter is a circular muscle. The urine then moves down into the urethra and pushes on the external sphincter muscle. And when the bladder contains approximately 800 milliliters, micturition will occur regardless of your effort. And 800 milliliters would correspond to about 32 ounces, which is quite a bit of urine. The fourth and final organ of the urinary system, the urethra, transports urine out of the body. So when micturition occurs, the urine leaves the body through the urethra, which is a single tube which extends from the trigon of the bladder to the exterior of the body. The male urethra is almost 4 times longer than that of the female, for obvious reasons. The urinary and reproductive systems join in the male, which means that they both share the male urethra. In females, the urethra is about 5 centimeters long, and it empties into the front of the vaginal opening. The female urethra carries only urine, and the female reproductive tract opens at the vagina, so they're not sharing a urethra. And since the female urethra is much shorter than the male urethra, women are more prone to suffer urinary tract infections or UTIs than men are. And these occur when bacteria outside the body somehow move up the urethra and colonize the bladder, which results in painful urination, which can be accompanied by bleeding from the bladder walls, which leads to blood in the urine. UTIs are serious infections and must be cleared up, usually by taking antibiotics because they're caused by bacteria. However, if the bacteria remain in the bladder, they can travel up the ureters to the kidneys and cause a kidney infection, which could be deadly. So UTIs are very serious, or they can be. These diagrams provide a comparison of the male and female urethras, and don't worry about any of these other parts. We'll cover them in the reproductive system. But in the female, you can see the urinary bladder and the urethra, and in the male, you can also see the urinary bladder and the much longer urethra. Incontinence is a condition in which an individual has lost control over urination, and it can occur in all age brackets and genders, but it is much more common in the elderly, especially elderly women. The causes of incontinence include chronic urinary tract infections. Incontinence can be a side effect of medication. It can be due to muscular weakness, an enlarged prostate gland in males, constipation, and I would say it would have to be a fairly severe case of constipation, or neuromuscular disease. And your book talks about 3 different types of incontinence. The first one is stress incontinence, and this is the leaking of urine during physical exertion. So this type of incontinence could occur when a person laughs so hard that they urinate themselves. Urge incontinence is the inability to quell the urge to urinate, and then overflow incontinence is the overflowing of the urinary bladder caused by waiting too long before urinating. And this is the type of incontinence which happens in young children who are still learning to control their sphincter muscles. The treatment for incontinence is typically tailored to the cause, and these include muscular strengthening exercises to increase the strength of the sphincters in the urethra, or behavioral modification may be recommended, so just not waiting too long to go in the case of overflow incontinence. Section 16.3, the urinary system maintains the body's fluid and solute balance. And we've touched on this in the previous slides, but anyway, another function of the kidneys is to maintain the body's water and salt balance. And we need to excrete or reabsorb many substances in order to keep our blood volume relatively constant and our blood pH at roughly 7.4. The urinary system is also responsible for returning key nutrients like carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins to the body, though it does not regulate the concentration or amount of these nutrients within the body. Moving on to the methods by which the urinary system maintains the body's water-salt balance. So excreted urine usually has a much different osmolarity than the blood, or this would be the concentration or the amount of water is what osmolarity is referring to. The fluid in the nephrons has the same water to solute ratio as the blood when first filtered. However, this ratio changes as the fluid moves through the nephron. Dilute urine is produced by removing solutes from the forming urine before it leaves the urine, or the nephron. As the ion concentration drops in the urine, the water proportion decreases, so fluid reaching the collecting duct is far less concentrated than blood plasma, resulting in dilute urine. So the concentration of water and solutes in your urine actually is responsible for the different colors of urine, and that's why urine higher in water concentration is lighter, whereas urine lower in water concentration is darker. But anyway, this concentrated urine is produced by the reabsorption of water at the loop of the nephron and the collecting duct. The cells of the DCT can be controlled so that they reabsorb water, and this is done through the use of certain hormones. Water can also be absorbed across the wall of the urinary bladder, which is quite helpful if we're needing to conserve water. Now we're going to talk about the hormonal controls over the urinary system. So the first one of these that we're going to talk about is ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. And this hormone is responsible for decreasing urine volume such that it inhibits urination, or it makes you not have to urinate. And this hormone is formed in the neurons of the hypothalamus and secreted by the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland in response to decreased blood volume. And this decreased blood volume is because we're low on water within the bloodstream. This causes the cells surrounding the collecting duct and the distal convoluted tubule to remove more water from the urine and return it to the depleted bloodstream. A good rule of thumb, though, when we talk about regulating water and sodium concentration is that where sodium goes, water follows. And the nephrons take advantage of this fact for reabsorption. More than 99% of the sodium filtered from the blood at the glomerulus is returned before the urine leaves the nephron. And 2/3 of this sodium reabsorption occurs at the proximal convoluted tubule. 25% of the filtered sodium is removed from the forming urine at the ascending limb of the loop of the nephron. Sodium is also reabsorbed in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. And I might have made a mistake on my slides that don't have audio or aren't a video. And just keep in mind that this slide is right as far as as far as ADH is concerned. Just remember that ADH decreases urine volume and keeps you from urinating, and it helps to keep water in the bloodstream. Here's the ADH feedback system, and this is a negative feedback system. We're just going to go through it real quick. So at the beginning, some stimulus disrupts homeostasis by increasing the ion concentration of plasma and interstitial fluid. The receptors in the hypothalamus then detect an increase in the osmolarity of the plasma, or an increase in water concentration, or rather a decrease in water concentration, excuse me. It's always a decrease when we're talking about ADH. This leads to the creation of nerve impulses which go to the hypothalamus and causes it to direct the posterior pituitary gland to secrete additional ADH. This increased release of ADH causes the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct to allow water to return to the bloodstream, and this leads to a decrease in ion concentration of the plasma and allows us to return to homeostasis. There are several hormones produced by the body and chemicals which can be ingested that affect salt regulation. And here are the salt regulation hormones. There's aldosterone, which is responsible for causing the excretion of potassium into the filtrate and allows us to reabsorb sodium from the urine. And this is what allows water to leave the filtrate with the sodium ions and ensures that water remains in the tissues of the body. There's brain natriuretic peptide, or BMP, which is a powerful vasodilator. And a vasodilator is just a hormone or drug possibly that increases blood pressure and blood volume. And then there's atrial natriuretic peptide, or AMP, and this might be wrong in the other set of urinary system slides. And this is also a powerful vasodilator such that it also increases blood pressure and blood volume. Specifically, this hormone dilates the afferent glomerular arteriole and decreases sodium reabsorption in the proximal convoluted tubule. And here are a couple chemicals which people commonly ingest that can affect salt regulation. The first of these is alcohol, which leads to an increase in urine production as it causes a decrease in ADH production. And this is the reason why drinking can cause you to urinate more than you normally would. And then finally there's caffeine, which increases urine production also through decreasing ADH production. And this decrease in ADH production can result in dehydration and muscle cramps. It can also cause us to have a lower blood pH, and this is actually the reason why it's not a good idea to exercise and then have a soda, because first of all, exercise will lower your blood pH, and then having a beverage with caffeine in it will further lower it, which could lead to problems. And also, I'd like to say that it may be possible that people who consume a lot of caffeine, they may develop more of a tolerance to caffeine, such that it doesn't make them urinate as much as someone who doesn't typically drink or have substances with caffeine in them. The kidneys also help maintain the blood's acid-base balance. And if you'll recall the bicarbonate buffer system of the respiratory system, well, anyway, in the urinary system, this reaction isn't carried out so much as we're just exchanging the hydrogen ions for bicarbonate ions. And the urinary system actually removes acidic and basic substances from the fluid and literally flushes them out of the body. So if the blood is too acidic, the kidneys can excrete hydrogen ions and return bicarbonate ions to the blood to maintain our pH. And if the blood is too basic, the kidneys will return hydrogen ions to the blood and excrete bicarbonate ions. This is kind of a slow pH adjustment than what is done in the respiratory system, but the results are permanent. Here's another feedback system of the urinary system, and this is the feedback system related to the regulation of blood pH. And these are also negative feedback systems, though keep in mind that the actual process of urination is a positive feedback system. But anyway, these diagrams are actually pretty similar. So the one at the left, the stimulus which disrupts blood homeostasis, is that the blood pH decreases and the blood becomes too acidic. This causes the kidneys to excrete hydrogen ions in the urine and send bicarbonate ions back to the blood, resulting in a return to homeostasis. Whereas the diagram at right, the stimulus here is that the blood pH increases such that it is too basic. This causes the kidneys to return the hydrogen ions to the blood and excrete the bicarbonate ions in the urine. And again, it returns us to homeostasis. Section 16.4, life-threatening diseases affect the urinary system. So urinalysis or urine analysis is the chemical analysis of urine. This is a simple, common, and non-invasive test routinely done in the doctor's office. And this is a test that they run after they make you pee in a cup, presumably. Urine is the byproduct of filtered blood, and any usual compounds or incorrect levels of normal blood constituents will appear in the urine. And this can reveal a number of serious diseases as well as the use of illegal drugs. Here are some compounds that, if found in the urine, can signal a problem. The first of these is albumin, and this is a small protein in the blood which helps to maintain osmotic pressure, And when this protein is present in the urine, or if any other protein is present in the urine, this condition is called proteinuria. And this means that the albumin is entering the urinary system at the glomerulus, and it could reflect excessively high blood pressure in the glomerulus or tears in the glomerular arterioles. And this condition can be caused by intense weight training. Hemoglobin in the blood indicates bleeding in the upper respiratory tract, whereas if you're finding intact erythrocytes, this indicates bleeding in the lower urinary tract, and either of these could signal a severe UTI or other more serious, or possibly more serious problem. Intact leukocytes indicate that an immune system response is occurring, usually in response to an infection of the urinary tract or possibly a kidney infection. Glucose in the urine, and we've talked about this earlier, signifies diabetes mellitus, or just diabetes. And finally, there are casts, which are plugs of material composed of minerals and or dead cells that build up in the tubules and then get forced out by pressure, and these can indicate some very serious kidney problems. This chart is showing the normal constituents of normal urine, and these constituents include volume, color, turbidity, odor, pH, and specific gravity. And feel free to read this. This chart shows some abnormal constituents which can be found in urine, and we went over most of these. There's albumin, glucose, red blood cells or erythrocytes, ketone bodies, which I'm just going to read real quick. High levels of ketone bodies in the urine, called ketonuria, may indicate diabetes mellitus, anorexia, typically starvation, or simply too little carbohydrates in the diet. There is bilirubin, or bilirubin, casts, and microbes. And microbes in the urine is never good for obvious reasons. Now we're going to talk about the 3 common types of kidney disease, and these can be life-threatening. Without properly functioning kidneys, blood composition can no longer be maintained, and will lose homeostasis, which can of course lead to death. And there are 3 types of kidney disease covered in the book. There's nephritis, nephritis, polycystic kidney disease, and this is the only one of these which can be inherited, and it causes cysts to form in the kidneys and destroys normal kidney tissue. A patient suffering from any 3 of these may require dialysis or possibly even a kidney transplant. Nephritis and glomerulonephritis are both nephron inflammations. And like I've said before, the kidney is covered by the renal capsule, and any inflammation within the kidney increases the pressure and slows or halts the filtration ability of the kidney. So glomerulonephritis is actually a blockage of the renal blood, it's a blockage of renal blood circulation with subsequent shutdown of the nephrons, whereas nephritis is the swelling of the nephron itself, which also leads to nephron shutdown. And the symptoms of both of these are nausea, dizziness, fatigue, and possibly memory loss. If the kidney cannot filter blood, the toxins build up and the blood becomes filled with wastes. If the ion and fluid balance is not eventually restored, death can result. So these are pretty serious conditions. One way of treating kidney disease is through dialysis. Dialysis is the exchange of aqueous substances between 2 solutions through a membrane, and this is actually what the nephrons do continually. Hemodialysis is the actual dialysis between blood and another fluid, and this process allows patients to compensate for their impaired kidney function until a properly functioning kidney is available for transplant. And in this process, the blood is withdrawn from an artery and passed across a dialysis membrane, and then it's sent back to the body. And this allows for toxins in the blood to diffuse into the prepared solution in the dialysis machine. And the plasma nutrients are either prevented from diffusing by putting the same concentration of these components in the dialysis fluid as in the blood, or you can add plasma nutrients to the blood by increasing their levels in the dialysis fluid. And this whole process takes 3 to 4 hours, and it must be performed 3 times a week. So it's obviously a pain in the butt for patients, but what are you going to do? Hemodialysis is an exhausting and extensive process, and it's rough on the blood cells or erythrocytes and leukocytes because they are passed through tubes and across membranes under pressure. There's another type of dialysis called peritoneal dialysis, which may be recommended if a patient requires dialysis over a long period of time, and this is obviously used in extreme cases. In this process, 2 liters of dialysis fluid are put directly into the abdominal cavity, left to diffuse for a period, and then removed. The peritoneum is actually what serves as the dialysis membrane in this process, and this must be completed several times a day in order to sustain life. Dialysis isn't really a long-time treatment for kidney disease, and this is why a kidney transplant may need to be performed. These transplants are typically highly successful, and part of this is due to the fact that the kidneys are easy to reach surgically because they're on either side of the lower back or spine. Kidneys essentially only have one artery and one vein, which can be easily cut and sutured to the donor kidney. And there's an almost 80% patient and organ survival rate after 1 year, which sounds a little low, but I guess we'll take that statistic. If the kidney is removed from a living, healthy donor, however, rather than an accident victim, the success rate is above 90%. And that completes our Chapter 16 slides. We'll be covering the immune system in the next module, which is the second longest set of lecture slides I've made, so be ready for that.